Hi, my name is Richard Lancaster and I'm a volunteer with the local Bristol Greenpeace group. And over the last couple of months, Greenpeace groups up and down the country have been organising screenings of a film called The Cost of Living. This is a film put together by Greenpeace and the New Economics Foundation. And it focuses on some communities in the north of England who are really struggling with the cost of living and the impact it's having on families. And it looks at their use of food banks and the problems they're having paying for their heating as we move into the winter especially. And this film and its associated presentation were, as I say, shown around the country. But for those of you who were not able to come to one of those showings, what I put together is a short kind of presentation here where I show the film and then I show the accompanying Greenpeace presentation, which puts in context the challenges and the solutions that Greenpeace is campaigning for. So without further ado, what I'm going to do now is to run the film, and then I'll go through the presentation after that.
Well, I've been working at Food Bank 10 years. I've been running as the head person now for about 3. Yeah. It's got more and more demanding. The pandemic was really bad, and then we had like a little lull, but now it's beginning to raise its head again. Yeah, it's getting worse. We usually open up on a Tuesday morning at 9:30, but they're queuing before that. What they're saying is we'll just have to put extra jumpers on. We can't afford to heat our homes, but we've got to put food on the table, and that's where we come in. We were originally just a top-up centre, but now what we're finding out is that basically they come in here because they just cannot afford to buy the food in the shops. They've got different things and tried to pay the bills. They've very little left for the food. So it's really becoming in winter a toss-up between the food and the bills. And I think, the food's got to win, otherwise they can't survive.
So the rents are going up, gas electric's going up, food's going out at window. What do? How do you look after your kids? How do you look after your elderly parents? You don't, because them at number 10 haven't got a clue what's going on in the real world.
I've lived in Sunnyside nearly 62 years, and I've lived in the same house. I'm great-grandma twice. I'm not old enough, you can say that if you want to me. I says, I dread to think what you're going to have to go through. I don't know how to feed and clothe kids, I honestly don't. And since it's been announced about the electricity and gas, there's a lot of people worried, a hell of a lot of people worried. I mean, community centre might have to close. Then you'd be sitting in house, just, deteriorating. You've got to keep your brain going, even if you haven't got one like me, but you have to keep it going. And talk to people, and that makes the world go round though, doesn't it? It's just friends, just friendly place to come and join in, because that's what it's all about.
We are all volunteers. It's a community thing. They pull together through thick and thin. And if somebody's going through a bad time, then even more we pull together and help them along. We just don't know nobody to go under. If we all go as individuals, it'll split, it'll not work.
When I'm on my own, I tend to feel like the problems are piling up politically, socially, financially. And then when you start talking to other people, you realise everybody's kind of struggling one way or another.
There's a huge amount of resilience in communities where people are really struggling. We saw this after COVID and we're seeing it now, and people will come out for other people. But people are also not stupid. People know that the government are letting them down and that they're failing them on a whole measure of responsibilities.
We do our own, we look after our own. And they all say, well, we do you this, we'll do you that. Come on then, where is it?
I mean, they found that word levelling up. I've never known none be levelled up. Because I thought they were going to have a better life, well, we'll vote for them for a change. And now we're in a bigger mess than I've ever known it.
I don't actually think they have any idea what it means to be in poverty in the remote rural area. I really don't. And there are a huge number of people who are in fuel poverty, in food poverty. You know, people are becoming more and more and more remote, not necessarily geographically, but remote from whatever else goes on in society. I don't think people in Westminster have the first idea of that.
They know that they're not going to be able to afford to pay their rent, to feed and clothe their kids, and to be able to heat their homes. I mean, that is an absolutely impossible situation to put people in.
They don't know where to go for help, so that's why the food banks are becoming more and more bombarded.
It's all right, that lot saying, what is it? Eat or heat. They want to try it, love.
People are very, very resourceful, and they will stand up for one another in their community, and, you know, they'll put things in place, but that can only go so far. You know, people haven't got the resources to play the role that the government would play.
The phrase that just keeps coming to mind, which was something that was used back in the 80s, was broken Britain. And we are broken. And I think we were broken then, but now we're in shattered little pieces. And I can't see how easily we can bring it all back together.
We've got really poorly insulated homes in this country, and our homes leak a huge amount of energy, so we're paying to put our heating on, and that energy is being wasted. We're wasting our money.
I can see a lot of people, elderly people, being cold in winter because they don't could put it on. They'll be sat with coats on and what have you.
There is a lot that the government could do about that by taking measures like loft insulation and wall cavities. But councils don't have the money to do this at the scale or at the speed that they need to. So often they're doing it in a really piecemeal way. It's taking a very, very long time. They can't go as far with upgrading homes as they would like to. This is why we're saying that we really, really need central government who have the money to kind of step in and play a big role in this.
The pit houses, particularly in Chinatown in Maltby, they've had the outside insulation done in some of them, but then because of government funding it was stopped.
Personally, we retrofitted it a few years ago. It made a huge difference. Our bills plummeted. We could feel a difference in the house itself, and we could feel the difference in terms of what we were paying out. I think we're losing that advantage now with the bills going up and up and up and up, which makes me feel so much more for the people who don't have that insulation.
One thing, what they should pull the socks up and go, is insulate all homes. All homes should be insulated.
Food banks, community cafes, all of these structures that have been set up with no support from the government, those structures are now becoming politicised. People are looking to the winter and they're thinking, well, like, hang on, how are we going to be able to keep this food bank running when no one can afford to give us donations? How are we going to be able to keep this community cafe running when, like, the fees for the building are going up? They're being just absolutely stretched to the limit.
Even when we're down and out, it's like something always turns up, always, and it's never failed us yet. So we've just got to carry on in that belief that it's going to be okay.
Something is changing in the public mood. People have been let down by politicians for decades, really. And that's meant that people have disengaged from politics. They might not vote, they might not see themselves as political in any way, but the level of public anger as people are being affected by this personally, their families, their neighbours, themselves, that is changing. They're starting to get organised in their communities. They're starting to talk about, you know, protest and strike and all of these kind of ideas that are really political.
I honestly think that because we went through a year of strike, I mean, I know it were in the 80s, but I think myself it made people stronger.
We don't get paid for our time or our cars. We use them because we want to use them, and wherever we can afford to do what we're doing, we will carry on doing it, as we have done over the last umpteen years, because we want to be part of this team. We want to work together for the good of the people of Maltby, and that's what matters.
There's always somebody in the community what would help. We try to help everybody.
We come back fighting. We don't lay down and die. You know what I mean? We'll come back fighting every time.
So we're currently in a climate emergency and a cost of living crisis. And it may not seem initially that those two are directly linked, but they really are. Now, I'd like to just take a look at this image and to see whether you can spot what you're looking at there. What do you think the data shows in the image? Well, you probably are aware that essentially that is showing global temperature changes. This climate stripes was created by climate scientist Ed Hawkins, and he wanted to show how the Earth's climate is changing in one single striking image. And each stripe shows the global average temperature for 1 year relative to the average temperature overall. So where it's white, it's the average. If it's darker blue, it's cooler than the average. And as you go through the oranges and into the dark red, it goes through hotter. Now, the Earth's climate has changed naturally throughout history. And there have been many natural changes in the Earth's climate in its 4.5 billion years. However, the average global temperature of Earth has increased a little over 1 degree since the 1880s. But most of that change has been since 1975. And scientists are now finding that the rate of change is faster than at any time in the Earth's history. And that's why we're calling it a climate crisis, because this is not a natural phenomenon. The temperature is increasing at an alarming rate, and it's already having negative impacts on people and on nature worldwide. This photograph of planet Earth, planet Earth, by the way, is that very small dot you can see on the right of the screen. It is known as the pale blue dot. It was taken in 1990 by Voyager 1, the space probe, from a record distance of 6 billion kilometers. And it serves to remind us how fragile and valuable and vulnerable our planet is. And it's often been said that there is no planet B. The climate crisis is caused by us burning fossil fuels. So that's oil and coal and gas. They contribute hugely to the greenhouse gases, mainly CO2, but others like methane as well, when they release these harmful amounts of chemicals into the atmosphere. Since the 1970s, CO2 emissions have increased globally by about 90%. And emissions from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes is about 55% of that total greenhouse gas emissions. The truth of the matter is we've already discovered and know about more fossil fuels than we could ever risk burning. So we've already basically got to the situation where we can't burn all the fossil fuels we already know about. So searching or drilling for more fossil fuels is simply not an option. Now, although burning of fossil fuels is the key contributor to climate change, agriculture and land use contribute also about 25% to global emissions. And this is largely due to deforestation and to unsustainable farming practices, palm oil plantations, soya production, which are both mainly used to create animal feed. And these are contributing to deforestation in places like the Amazon. And before reaching our plates, Food is produced, stored, processed, packaged, transported and prepared, and at each stage that produces greenhouse gas emissions. We're also losing what we call carbon sinks. So the carbon sinks, which are things like the oceans and forests, are capable of absorbing around 50% of the carbon emitted into the atmosphere. But these natural carbon sinks are also being threatened by extraction practices. For example, peatlands in the UK are being burnt and destroyed, as this picture shows. And when they are destroyed like this, they in turn emit further CO2, increasing the risk of floods and can also damage water quality. This rapid climate change is having a devastating impact on nature. We're seeing grasslands getting drier, saltier, salt marshes and sea ice disappearing. And in the Arctic, sea ice disappears almost entirely in the summer now. Many species are struggling to adapt to their rapidly changing environment. And around 1 million plant and animal species are threatened with extinction if climate change isn't halted. Extreme weather events like fires can also destroy landscapes. And we're seeing the impacts here in the UK. The UK's 10 warmest years since records began in the 1880s have happened since 2002. And last summer, the summer of 2022, was the joint hottest summer on record for England. And drought was actually declared across 9 areas in Britain. Millions of communities globally are threatened by sea level rise and extreme weather. Communities are being forced to move due to land loss, and people have lost their livelihoods in their homes. And this photograph here is just an example of the sorts of flooding that we've seen in many places, including over the summer in Pakistan. And we've also seen heat waves. The UK experienced record temperatures, and estimates put it at more than 2,800 excess deaths due to the heat. We are seeing the impacts on communities here in Britain. The community of Fairbourne in Wales is likely to be one of the first communities in the world that becomes a victim of climate change, in that the entire village is going to be decommissioned. Essentially, the Welsh government has said that they can no longer defend the village against the sea as the storms and as the rising sea levels come along. They don't think they can ever, they can maintain the defences, and that by 2050, they're talking about moving everyone out of the village and letting the village just go back into the sea. And we've got a short video about the impact that would have on the villagers, which I'm just now going to run. So we just watch that video.
How would I describe Fairbourne? Well, if God had a garden, this area would be it. I've got the mountains behind me. I've got the estuary that goes up to Dolgethley. It's my little piece of paradise.
When we moved here, the word flood was branded about, but not very much. But in the last year, the flooding has hit the media more due to the climate change issues, and the whole village will need to be decommissioned and returned to the sea.
95% of the community were sat at home watching the television when they were told on television that we were going to be decommissioned and moved out of our houses, and the whole village would be demolished and returned to the sea as a salt marsh. To hear that was absolutely devastating. Overnight, properties lost so much value, 40% value. The knock-on effect from that was then initially no insurance, no mortgages. So it had a devastating effect.
What we've got here is the fact that it's a whole community that we're looking at. It's not just a street that might need to be moved back or a road that needs to be adapted. This is a whole community of people, and that in itself is a challenging situation.
For the people here in Fairborn, it is an uncertain future. We're seeing the sea level here rise by an average of 4.7 millimetres every year. And clearly that's going to have an impact on the community behind the sea defences, which are below the level of high tide already.
As we get global warming, we get the sea level rise, we get the more intense storms, we get the coastal inundation, it's going to get more and more serious. And just trying to protect ourselves from those storms is going to become more and more difficult. Similar things are going to have to happen in other parts of the country, and they're going to have to abandon places that have been lived in for centuries.
Borth is just 14 miles down the coast from Fairborn. A lovely place to be in the summer when the sun is shining. A very strong sense of community. I think it's unique. Maybe everybody feels like that about their community, but I think Borth is quite special. The thought of it one day not being here, it's not something you like to think about, really.
A few years back, we had a massive storm and the village was evacuated.
Every time a wave came over and broke, it would just pour down the alleyway and onto the road like a river. I can't really put it into words, but the strangest thing I could see was the swell was that big and the waves were so huge, the whole horizon had almost lifted within your eye line. You can't underestimate the power of the sea, that's for sure.
When the weather gets really bad and the wind's in the right direction, the sea ends up in the road, and these houses here, they all get battered. And half the stones on the beach end up in the road. People are habitating areas at the moment that they can habitate, but things are changing now, so people either have to move or just get flooded out.
We have similar communities like this up and down the coast. So what we need to see is public sector bodies in general having a shift in mindset in terms of the way they approach this issue.
I'm not seeing enough politicians talking about this as a serious issue, and coastal communities like this are at risk.
Our coastlines are vast. We've got lots of towns and villages on them that will all disappear. And again, it's not just a UK problem, it's a global problem. There's thousands of miles of coastline all around the world.
Storms will get more intense, the hurricanes and the cyclones, and as they reap their ill effects, they hit many millions of people, and they seem to particularly affect people on the coast who are very vulnerable and have no way of responding, and also, quite unjustly, aren't part of the rich community that have been the cause of the global changes in the first place.
I think it almost doesn't feel real in some sense that, you know, you hear about these things and it's kind of in the news, unless you actually see things happening. Like, you imagine sort of rock slides of things falling off into the sea and stuff like that, but it's not like that, you know, it's just sort of very gradual, very insidious thing. This is such a normal, you know, really nice countryside, really nice beaches and seafront, and you just think, oh, that'll always be like that, but it won't.
Our children have actually left school to go on the climate protest marches. So I see a whole new generation who are aware of, you know, what is happening and how important it is that they make the government sit up and take notice, because it's them who will be affected, and our grandchildren.
But no, I wasn't interested in climate change. And then suddenly this happens to your village, and then you start taking notice of, this is a bit important. Brexit, I'm afraid, is nothing to global warming. This isn't our planet, we've borrowed it from the next generation. And we've really left them something to try and sort out.
So that told the story of what's happening in Fairborn. The other thing that it's very important to understand is that not everyone is equally affected by the climate emergency. The reality is that those in the global south are going to be far more impacted by the devastating effects of floods, storms, wildfires, droughts, and rising sea levels than many in the global north. And the irony and the unfairness of this is that those in the global south are the ones who've done least to cause the problem. The majority of the carbon that has already been emitted into the atmosphere has been emitted by the global north, but it is the global south that is suffering the first effects and will suffer the most dramatic effects. And what I've got now is a short video featuring Maya Rose Craig, an environmentalist and diversity activist, who some of you will know as Bird Girl. She's a local Bristol-based activist. She's just going to run through this video now and explain the links between the climate crisis and also racism, and how it is that people of colour and the communities that are least able to defend themselves against the changes that are coming, that are going to be suffering the most. So we just watch that video together now.
Some people just don't get it when I tell them that systemic racism and environmental destruction are linked, but both have roots in the horrors of slavery and the British Empire. Lives were ruined, resources were stolen, and racist ideas were used to justify it. And it's not ended. People of colour from London to Lagos are still paying the price. It's air pollution hitting people of colour harder in the UK. It's Indigenous peoples across the world who come second to our need for oil and palm oil. It's communities who are left dealing with the waste we dump back on their shores. This is the story powerful people and corporations don't want you to know about. You won't have learned in school that systemic racism, the British Empire and climate change are all linked. And you won't find the media talking about how it plays out today. But let's go back a bit. It was racism and racist practices that were used to justify environmental destruction by the British Empire in countries like Nigeria and India. When the slave trade was abolished, the British ruling class went looking for other ways to make money. As the Industrial Revolution took off in Britain, whole swathes of Nigeria were colonised by the British through the Royal Niger Company. The British were after palm oil to sell to British manufacturers, who needed it to grease their new machinery. The Royal Niger Delta Company was bought by a UK business looking for palm oil, a key ingredient in their famous Sunlight soap. And who did that company become? One of the biggest corporations in the world today, Unilever.
Domestos.
Then it was the 1850s, and British companies went looking for fuel to power their new steamboats and railways, firing up the world's fossil fuel obsession. In India, British corporations bought land people were living on so that they could mine their dirty coal. They forced people to work in these dangerous mines which polluted the air and water. The coal was brought back to Britain and sold to line the pockets of British elites. During the tyranny of the British Empire, $45 trillion was siphoned out of India into the hands of the British.
Britain came to one of the richest countries in the world in the early 18th century and reduced it after 200 years of plunder to one of the poorest. But all of that is really not known anymore.
Later on, Winston Churchill changed the British Navy fuel supply from coal to oil. That's when the British government bought Nigeria. The British government bought Nigeria. This really did happen.
In 1900, Britain officially assumed responsibility for the administration of the whole of what we now know as Nigeria from the Niger Company, as this ceremony recalls.
This meant that they could give exclusive access to oil-rich land to British company Shell, guaranteeing a long-term supply of oil. This had a devastating impact on the local population and the environment. Shell has shamelessly raked in the profits from the Delta region of Nigeria ever since. The relentless extraction of coal and oil would land us here in 2022 in a climate and nature crisis. Up until 1882, more than half the world's emissions came from the UK alone. The richest and most industrialised countries are responsible for 90% of excess greenhouse gas emissions. This has led to the heating of the planet, causing extreme weather events across the globe which disproportionately affect people of colour. The 3 countries most affected by extreme weather events in 2019 were Mozambique, Zimbabwe and the Bahamas. In 2019, Mozambique was hit by 2 massive cyclones, causing hundreds of deaths and catastrophic damage. Yet, it contributed just 0.02% of global carbon dioxide emissions. Across India, Bangladesh and Pakistan, extreme weather events caused by climate change displaced more than 10 million people each year. My own family's village in Bangladesh has been severely affected by both flooding and drought. Not only is the extraction of resources and burning of fossil fuels leading to the destruction of people's lands and livelihoods, but racism is being used to justify it. This destructive global economic system continues to rule our lives today. Corporations continue to plunder for raw materials such as fossil fuels, palm oil, grain, soya and fish, without regard for local people. Take fish, for example. African waters are emptied of fish by big corporations at the expense of local communities, only to be used in fish farms, pig feed and cosmetics in Europe and Asia. Meat and dairy production is also responsible for the deforestation of indigenous land in Brazil to grow soya for animal feed. This soya is used to feed cattle and chickens on British farms, and the profits never make it back to local indigenous people in Brazil, but go to giant agricultural businesses and UK supermarkets like Tesco. Racist ideas about indigenous people have been used to justify the theft of their land and attacks on indigenous rights. Indigenous people in the Amazon have defended their land against profit-hungry governments and corporations for decades, and many, many indigenous activists who have spoken out have been murdered. Not only is indigenous land being destroyed for the products on our shelves, the plastic waste these products create is then dumped in other countries. The UK government exports half of the waste that they claim is recycled. 40% of this goes to Turkey, which just doesn't have the infrastructure to deal with it. You might remember Unilever from the start of our story. Well, this British Empire-linked company is now one of the biggest plastic polluters in the world. We mentioned Unilever's thirst for palm oil at the start of the British Empire, and, well, incredibly, it's still happening 100 years later. Palm oil is an ingredient in everything, from Dove soap to Magnum ice cream. Unilever's palm oil supply chain is linked to 250,000 football pitches worth of deforestation in Indonesia, and that's just in the past 3 years, as well as human rights abuses against indigenous peoples and local communities. The lives of people of colour here in the UK are being affected too. People of colour in the UK are much more likely to live close to incinerators, breathe dangerous and illegal levels of air pollution, and have less access to green spaces and gardens. Right now, as we face the worst cost of living crisis in 50 years, over half of ethnic minority children in the UK are already living in poverty, with that figure set to rise. Waste incinerators are 3 times more likely to be built in the UK's most deprived neighbourhoods than the least. To look at just one example, an incinerator in Edmonton, North London, where 65% of residents are people of colour, is going ahead despite protests. Concerns about people's lives in Edmonton weren't listened to, but plans for an incinerator in wealthy Cambridge were dropped because of concerns that it wasn't in keeping with historical buildings. Lives or buildings. The environmental emergency and systemic racism are 2 sides of the same coin. We can't tackle one without tackling the other. We need to move away from an economic system that treats people of colour across the world and nature like resources to be mined for profit, to one that's grounded in restoring nature, local economies, and allowing everyone to thrive. We must shift power and resources to community leaders, activists, and experts within communities of colour who are facing destruction and discrimination. Big corporations are happy fueling the climate crisis and this toxic economic system.
As energy prices and bills continue to surge, Shell has announced record profits of more than £7 billion.
We must call out those most responsible for causing the environmental emergency.
Mr Van Beurden, I just want to start by saying that you should be absolutely ashamed of yourself for the devastation that you have caused to communities all over the world. Shell has spent millions covering up the warnings from climate scientists.
They want us to be divided into neat activist groups, never uniting or building enough power to actually win. And they try to distract us with their glitzy PR campaigns. They hope that we focus on our individual actions rather than centuries of exploitation. They want us to blame each other for the climate crisis. But we're determined to build a powerful, diverse movement to win a fairer world. We know the real villains are the powerful people burning and looting our planet for profit. And we know that it's only together, united, that we can defeat them.
So that was a video exposing the links of the climate crisis and racism and the historical background to that and the context to that. A cost of living crisis is affecting all areas of Britain. This map created by End Fuel Poverty Coalition shows the areas in England most heavily hit by the cost of living crisis. Estimates say that 20–25% of neighbourhoods are now rated worse for fuel poverty in many areas across the country. The darker the blue, the harder people are finding it to make ends meet. So you might think, well, the solution is we need to get more oil and gas, but that isn't the actual answer for a number of reasons. One, because of the climate, the devastating effect it would have on the climate and how it would make the climate emergency worse. But also because if they did get out more oil and gas from, say, the North Sea, it wouldn't actually reduce prices a jot in Britain, because that oil and gas doesn't belong to Britain. It belongs to the big oil companies, the Shells, the BPs, the Exxons of this world, and they just sell it on the open market. And in fact, ironically, since the fuel crisis and the energy crisis has hit, Britain has actually increased its exports of of gas from the North Sea. So even if we did start drilling for more oil and gas, it wouldn't actually bring any prices down. The answer is a massive investment in renewable energy. And the key thing about that is that once, new solar, wind and solar and wind power have been shown to be 9 times cheaper than gas at the moment. If we'd invested when we should have started investing in renewables, we wouldn't be facing the same level of crisis that we are, because we wouldn't be so dependent on imported fossil fuels. We have massive opportunities for renewable energy around Britain, offshore wind and onshore wind and solar. And it would also create jobs, estimates of 150,000 UK jobs in the green industries. So that's what we're pressing for: more renewable energy, a massive investment in renewable energy, and as quickly as possible. Also, to upgrade the British housing stock. Currently, something only like 1.8% of new UK homes meet the top rating efficiency. So we need to invest in insulation, as it said in the first video, in order to cut down on our energy use, to save energy, in order to bring down people's fuel energy bills. What's Greenpeace doing? Well, we've been taking it to the heart of government. This Warm This Winter campaign, we've been pointing out, this was a protest at the Conservative Party conference when we interrupted Liz Truss's televised speech to hold her to account for breaking her party's election manifesto policies and for U-turning on policies across environmental protection, climate action and workers' rights, things that nobody had voted for. What can you do? Well, if you've got a Conservative MP, you can write to them and demand action. You can find out more about your MP from theyworkforyou.com. And then you can include your name and address, how the cost of living crisis is affecting you, and offer them the solutions to bring down bills, to make our houses warmer, and to reduce our reliance on climate wrecking oil and gas by investing in cheaper renewable energy, insulating our homes, and supporting bill payers. And ask your MP to take action. If your MP isn't a Conservative MP, then you need to write to this man. Write to the Secretary of State for Energy, and again, essentially bringing out exactly the same points that you would have done to your MP. In your community, you can support your community. You can get involved with Citizens Advice, volunteer at a food bank, and of course, join your local Greenpeace group. And in Bristol, here where I'm based, we have a very active Greenpeace local group, which you can find just by Googling Greenpeace Bristol. And we meet monthly to organise our campaigns, and those are both in person and hybrid, so you can join via Zoom as well. So that was basically all I wanted to say. That just shows you the videos that we showed when we were showing the cost of living film, the video about Fairborn in Wales, and the video bringing out the historic links between racism and our colonialism and the climate crisis. So thank you for watching, and I hope maybe to see you at one of our Greenpeace meetings, either online or in person. Thank you.